Charles wiped the sweat from his forehead as he climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the attic of his grandmother's old Victorian house. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows, creating dancing patterns of light across the cluttered space. He had been avoiding this task for months since Grandmother Rose passed away, but the house needed to be cleared before the estate sale next week. The attic smelled of old wood, mothballs, and decades of forgotten memories. Boxes were stacked everywhere, each one labeled in his grandmother's careful handwriting. Christmas decorations 1987, Papa's Army medals, wedding photos. Charles smiled sadly as he remembered how organized she had always been, even in her final years. He started with the boxes near the window, working methodically through old clothes, books, and kitchen items. Most things would go to charity, but he set aside a few special pieces that held memories. His grandmother's jewelry box, a set of china that had belonged to his great-grandmother, and a leather-bound photo album filled with pictures of family gatherings from decades past. As the afternoon wore on, Charles moved deeper into the attic, toward the back corner where the oldest boxes seemed to be stored. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and he had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling. It was there, partially hidden behind a trunk full of old quilts, that he spotted something unusual. Unlike the other neatly labeled boxes, this one was different. It was smaller, made of dark wood rather than cardboard, and it had no label at all. The box looked handmade, with intricate carvings along the sides that reminded Charles of the jewelry boxes he had seen in antique stores. A small brass lock held it closed, but the lock looked old and worn. Charles carefully lifted the wooden box and examined it more closely. The carvings were beautiful, depicting roses and vines that twisted around the entire surface. On the top, carved in elegant script, were the initials DM. Charles frowned, trying to think of any family members with those initials. His grandmother had been Rose Patterson, and his grandfather was William Patterson. His mother was Margaret, and his father was Robert. He couldn't think of anyone in the family with the initials DM. The brass lock was indeed old, and when Charles gently tested it, he found that it was loose. With a little pressure, the lock opened with a soft click. Charles hesitated for a moment, feeling like he was about to invade someone's privacy, but his curiosity won over his reservations. Inside the box, wrapped in faded blue silk, was a collection of items that took Charles completely by surprise. There were several photographs, some letters tied with a pink ribbon, a small piece of jewelry, and what appeared to be a pressed flower. The photographs were black and white, clearly from many decades ago, and they showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and bright eyes. Charles picked up the photographs and studied them carefully. The woman in the pictures was stunning, with a smile that seemed to light up the entire photograph. She was wearing clothes from what looked like the 1940s or 1950s, and in several of the pictures, she was standing next to a handsome young man in a military uniform. The man looked familiar, but Charles couldn't quite place where he had seen that face before. As he continued looking through the photographs, Charles found one that made his heart skip a beat. It was a picture of the same young woman, but this time she was standing next to someone Charles recognized immediately. It was his grandfather, William Patterson, but he looked decades younger than Charles had ever seen him. William was wearing a military uniform and had his arm around the woman's waist. They both looked incredibly happy. Charles sat back on his heels, staring at the photograph. His grandfather had served in World War II. Charles knew that much, but he had never talked much about his war years. Charles's grandmother Rose had always said that William preferred not to discuss that time in his life, that it brought back too many difficult memories. But this photograph suggested there was more to his grandfather's war story than Charles had ever known. Who was this beautiful woman, and why did his grandfather have his arm around her in such an intimate way? Charles had always believed that his grandparents had been childhood sweethearts who married young and stayed together their entire lives. With trembling hands, Charles reached for the letters tied with the pink ribbon. There were 5 letters in total, and they were all addressed to "My dearest William," in the same elegant handwriting. The return address on the envelopes simply said, "Diana Miller," which explained the initials DM on the box. Charles carefully opened the first letter, which was dated March 15, 1943. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear and readable. As he began to read, Charles felt like he was stepping into a completely different world, one where his grandfather was a young soldier far from home, and Diana Miller was the woman who held his heart. The letter was full of love and longing, describing Diana's daily life in a small English village while William was stationed overseas. She wrote about her work at the local hospital, helping to care for wounded soldiers, and about how much she missed him. She mentioned their walks through the countryside, their favorite pub where they would meet for dinner, and their plans for after the war ended. Charles read through all 5 letters, each one more revealing than the last. It became clear that William and Diana had been deeply in love, and that they had planned to marry after the war. Diana wrote about the wedding dress she was saving money to buy, about the little house they had looked at together, and about the children they hoped to have someday. But as Charles read the final letter, dated September 8, 1944, a sense of dread began to build in his stomach. This letter was different from the others. Diana's handwriting seemed more hurried, more desperate, and her words carried a weight of sadness that hadn't been present in the earlier letters. In this last letter, Diana wrote about rumors she had heard, about William being reported missing in action after a mission went wrong. She begged him to write to her, to let her know he was safe, to come back to her, as he had promised. She wrote about waiting by the window every day for the postman, hoping for news, any news at all. Charles set the letter down with shaking hands. His grandfather had never been missing in action, at least not according to any family stories Charles had heard. William had served honorably in the war and returned home to marry Rose in 1946. Charles had seen their wedding photos many times, and his grandfather looked happy and healthy in those pictures. But if William had returned safely from the war, what had happened to Diana Miller? Why had she believed he was missing? And most importantly, why had William kept these letters and photographs hidden away for all these years, even after marrying Rose and starting a family? Charles carefully placed everything back in the wooden box, his mind racing with questions. He felt like he had stumbled upon a family secret that had been buried for over 70 years, and he wasn't sure what to do with this new information. Should he tell his mother about what he had found? Should he try to find out more about Diana Miller and what had happened to her? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the attic floor, Charles made a decision. He would take the box home with him and try to piece together the mystery of his grandfather's hidden past. Somewhere out there had to be more answers about Diana Miller and the love story that had been forgotten by everyone except William Patterson himself. Charles tucked the wooden box under his arm and carefully made his way back down the narrow staircase. He had come to the attic looking for old household items to donate to charity. But instead, he had discovered a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about his family's history. The house felt different as he walked through it now, knowing that it had been keeping this secret for so many years. Every room seemed to hold the possibility of more hidden stories, more forgotten truths that had been carefully tucked away and never spoken about. As Charles locked up the house and drove home, he couldn't stop thinking about the photographs of Diana Miller. Her smile had been so bright, so full of life and hope. She had loved his grandfather deeply. That much was clear from her letters, and she had believed they would spend their lives together. But something had gone wrong, something that had separated them forever and left Diana believing that William was dead. Charles was determined to find out what had happened, even if it meant uncovering truths that his family might prefer to keep buried. Charles spent the entire weekend researching everything he could find about Diana Miller and his grandfather's military service. He started by going through his grandmother's old papers, looking for any mention of Diana or any clues about William's time in the war. Rose had kept meticulous records of everything, from household expenses to family letters, but there was no mention of Diana Miller anywhere. On Monday morning, Charles called the local library and spoke to Mrs. Henderson, the librarian who specialized in local history and genealogy research. She had helped Charles trace his family tree a few years earlier when he was working on a school project with his daughter. Mrs. Henderson was excited to help with the mystery. She suggested that Charles start by looking through military records and local newspaper archives from the 1940s. She also recommended checking with the local historical society, which had an extensive collection of wartime documents and photographs. Charles took a day off work and drove to the County Historical Society, a small building that had once been a bank, but now housed thousands of documents, photographs, and artifacts from the area's past. The volunteer coordinator, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, listened carefully as Charles explained what he was looking for. Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up when Charles mentioned the name Diana Miller. He disappeared into the back rooms for several minutes before returning with a thick folder marked Miller Family, Wartime Correspondence. Inside the folder were dozens of documents related to the Miller family during World War II. Diana Miller had indeed lived in the area, and her father had been a prominent local businessman who owned a small factory that produced supplies for the war effort. There were newspaper clippings about the family's contributions to the war effort, including several mentions of Diana's volunteer work at the local military hospital. But it was a newspaper clipping from October 1944 that made Charles's blood run cold. The headline read, "Local Woman Dies in Factory Accident," and the accompanying article described how Diana Miller, age 23, had been killed when a piece of machinery malfunctioned at her father's factory. The accident had occurred on September 15, 1944, just 1 week after she had written her final letter to William. Charles read the article 3 times, trying to process what this meant. Diana hadn't lived to see the end of the war. She had died believing that William was missing in action, never knowing that he had survived and returned home safely. The tragedy of it overwhelmed Charles, and he had to sit down for a moment to collect himself. Mr. Thompson noticed Charles's distress and brought him a glass of water. Charles explained what he had discovered, and Mr. Thompson nodded sympathetically. He had seen many similar stories over the years, families torn apart by war and tragedy, lives changed forever by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But Mr. D. Thompson had more information to share. He pulled out another folder, this one marked Patterson Family Military Service. Inside were William Patterson's military records, including his service history, commendations, and correspondence. The record showed that William had indeed been reported missing in action in August 1944, just as Diana's letter had mentioned. His unit had been involved in a mission behind enemy lines in France, and several soldiers had been unaccounted for after the mission went wrong. William had been listed as missing for nearly 3 weeks before he was found, injured but alive, recovering in a military hospital. Charles found a copy of the telegram that had been sent to William's family, informing them that he had been found and was recovering from his injuries. The telegram was dated September 20th, 1944, 5 days after Diana had died in the factory accident. As Charles pieced together the timeline, the tragic irony of the situation became clear. Diana had died believing that the man she loved was gone forever, while William had been lying in a hospital bed, probably thinking about her and planning their reunion. By the time William was well enough to write letters again, Diana was already buried in the local cemetery. Mr. Thompson helped Charles find Diana's grave in the cemetery records. She was buried in Hillside Cemetery, not far from where Charles's grandmother's house stood. Charles had driven past that cemetery countless times over the years, never knowing that it held such an important piece of his family's history. That afternoon, Charles drove to Hillside Cemetery and found Diana's grave. It was a simple headstone, weathered by decades of rain and snow, with just her name, dates, and the words "beloved daughter" carved into the stone. Someone had placed fresh flowers there recently, which surprised Charles until he noticed that the flowers were the same type of roses that had been carved into the wooden box. Charles stood there for a long time, thinking about the young woman who had loved his grandfather so deeply and had died so young. He wondered if William had ever visited this grave, if he had been the one leaving flowers all these years. The thought made Charles's heart ache for both of them. When Charles got home that evening, he called his mother, Margaret, and told her about his discovery. Margaret listened in stunned silence as Charles described finding the letters, learning about Diana's death, and visiting her grave. After a long pause, Margaret spoke quietly. "I always wondered why Dad seemed so sad sometimes, especially around the anniversary dates in September. Your grandmother used to worry about him during those times. He would become very quiet and would often go for long drives by himself." Margaret told Charles that she remembered as a child, occasionally finding her father looking through old photographs that he would quickly put away when anyone came into the room. She had assumed they were war pictures that brought back difficult memories, but now she realized they might have been pictures of Diana. Charles asked his mother if she thought his grandmother Rose had known about Diana. Margaret considered this for a moment before answering. "I think she probably suspected something. Your grandmother was a very wise woman, and she loved Dad deeply. If she knew he had lost someone important during the war, she would have understood and given him space to grieve." Margaret also shared a memory that suddenly made sense in light of the new information. She remembered that every year on September 15th, her father would buy a bouquet of white roses and disappear for a few hours. When he returned, he would be very quiet for the rest of the day. Rose had always made sure to prepare his favorite dinner on those days and would be extra gentle with him. The next day, Charles returned to the attic to look for more clues. This time, he searched more carefully through his grandfather's personal belongings. In a trunk that contained William's military uniforms and medals, Charles found another small box hidden beneath some old blankets. This box contained more photographs of Diana, including some that showed her working at the hospital where she had volunteered. There was also a small engagement ring, still in its original box, with a receipt showing that William had purchased it in August 1944, probably planning to propose to Diana when he returned from his mission. At the very bottom of the box, Charles found a letter that his grandfather had written but never sent. It was addressed to Diana and dated October 1944. In the letter, William wrote about being in the hospital, about how much he missed her, and about his plans for their future together. The letter ended with William saying that he would write to her every day until he was well enough to come home to her. Charles realized that William must have written this letter before learning of Diana's death. When he finally received word of the factory accident, he would have understood that his letters would never be read, that the future he had planned would never come to pass. There was one more item in the box that broke Charles's heart. It was a small calendar from 1944, with September 15th circled in red ink. In William's handwriting, someone had written Diana and drawn a small heart. This was the day she had died, and it was clear that William had marked it as a day to remember her. Charles sat in the attic surrounded by the remnants of a love story that had ended in tragedy over 70 years ago. He understood now why his grandfather had never talked about the war, why he had seemed sad on certain dates, and why he had kept these mementos hidden away where no one else would find them. But Charles also realized that there was still more to this story. William had gone on to marry Rose and build a happy life with her. They had raised 3 children together and had been married for over 50 years before Rose passed away. William had found a way to honor Diana's memory while still opening his heart to love again. The wooden box had held not just letters and photographs, but the story of a man who had experienced both profound loss and enduring love. Charles felt privileged to have discovered this piece of his family's history, but he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with knowing such a deeply personal secret. As he carefully packed everything back into the boxes, Charles made a decision. He would continue visiting Diana's grave and leaving flowers, carrying on the tradition that his grandfather had started. It seemed like the right way to honor both Diana's memory and his grandfather's enduring love for her. 2 weeks after discovering the wooden box, Charles found himself driving to the address listed in one of Diana's letters. He had spent hours researching the Miller family and had learned that Diana's younger brother, Robert Miller, was still alive and living in a nursing home about an hour away from Charles's town. Robert Miller was now 95 years old, one of the few remaining people who had actually known Diana personally. Charles had called ahead and spoken to the nursing home staff, explaining that he had some items that had belonged to Robert's sister and asking if it would be possible to visit. When Charles arrived at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, he was greeted by a cheerful nurse who led him to a sunny common room where Robert was waiting. Despite his advanced age, Robert's eyes were bright and alert, and he smiled warmly when Charles introduced himself. Charles had brought the wooden box with him, along with copies of the photographs and letters. As he carefully explained how he had discovered these items, Robert's eyes filled with tears. He reached out with shaking hands to touch the photographs of his sister. "I haven't seen these pictures in over 70 years," Robert said softly. "Diana was the most beautiful person inside and out. She had such a kind heart, always helping others, always seeing the best in everyone." Robert told Charles stories about Diana that brought her to life in ways the letters never could. He described how Diana had taught him to ride a bicycle, how she had saved her allowance to buy him books, and how she had always defended him when other children teased him for being smaller than his classmates. He also shared memories of Diana and William together. Robert had been only 15 when his sister died, but he remembered William clearly. "He was a good man, your grandfather," Robert said. "Diana absolutely adored him. They were planning to get married as soon as the war ended. She talked about him constantly, showed everyone his letters, spent hours knitting socks and scarves to send to him overseas." Robert's voice grew sad as he continued. "The day we got word that William was missing in action, Diana was devastated. She refused to believe he was dead, kept saying she would feel it in her heart if something had happened to him. She was right, of course. He wasn't dead. But she never got to find that out." Charles asked Robert about the factory accident that had killed Diana. Robert's expression grew dark, and he was quiet for several moments before answering. "That accident should never have happened," Robert said firmly. "The factory had been pushing workers to meet impossible deadlines for military contracts. The machinery was old and poorly maintained, but Father refused to spend money on repairs when there was so much pressure to produce supplies for the war effort." Robert explained that Diana had been working at the factory to help with the war effort, even though she was already volunteering at the hospital. On the day of the accident, she had been asked to work a double shift because several other workers had called in sick. Diana was exhausted, Robert remembered. She had worked at the hospital all night, caring for wounded soldiers, then went straight to the factory that morning. She should have been at home sleeping, but she felt it was her duty to help however she could. The machinery malfunction that killed Diana had been caused by a worn belt that snapped, sending metal parts flying across the factory floor. Diana had been struck in the head and died instantly. Robert said the family had always blamed themselves for not insisting that she rest instead of working such long hours. As they talked, Robert revealed something that surprised Charles. After the war ended, and news reached the Miller family that William Patterson had survived and returned home, Robert had tried to find him to let him know what had happened to Diana. "I felt he deserved to know the truth," Robert explained. "I imagined he might be wondering why Diana had stopped writing to him, but when I finally tracked him down, I learned that he had gotten married just a few months earlier." Robert had wrestled with whether to contact William and potentially disrupt his new marriage. In the end, he decided to respect William's new life and keep Diana's memory to himself. "Perhaps that was wrong of me," Robert admitted, "but I was young, and I didn't want to cause more pain than the war had already caused." Charles assured Robert that he had made the right decision. He told Robert about his grandparents' long and happy marriage, about the family William and Rose had built together, and about the love and respect that had characterized their relationship until the very end. But Charles also shared what he had learned about his grandfather's quiet annual visits to Diana's grave. Robert's eyes widened in surprise and then filled with tears again. "He remembered her," Robert whispered. "All those years. He remembered her." Robert then shared a secret he had kept for over 70 years. He had been visiting Diana's grave every month since her death, bringing fresh flowers and keeping the headstone clean. He had always wondered who was leaving the white roses that appeared every September, but he had never seen anyone else there. "It was your grandfather," Robert realized. "All this time we were both visiting her, both remembering her, but we never knew about each other." Charles felt a deep sense of connection as he listened to Robert's stories. This elderly man had loved and missed Diana for 7 decades. Just as William had carried her memory in his heart while building a new life with Rose. The love that Diana had inspired had endured long after her death, touching multiple generations without any of them realizing it. Robert asked if he could keep one of the photographs of Diana, and Charles was happy to give him several. In return, Robert went to his room and brought back a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Diana. Inside were some of her personal items, including a locket that contained a tiny photograph of William in his military uniform. "She wore this every day after he left for overseas," Robert told Charles. "She was wearing it when she died. I've kept it all these years, but I think it belongs with the rest of her things now." Before leaving the nursing home, Charles made a promise to Robert. He would ensure that Diana's memory was properly honored, and he would continue the tradition of bringing flowers to her grave. Robert, in turn, promised to write down more of his memories of Diana so that her story would not be lost when he was gone. Over the following months, Charles learned more about both sides of his family's history. His mother helped him organize all the documents and photographs they had found, creating a complete record of Diana and William's love story and its tragic ending. Charles also reached out to other members of the Patterson family, sharing the story with his cousins and uncles. Everyone was moved by the discovery, and several family members expressed regret that William had carried this burden alone for so many years. Charles's daughter, Emily, was particularly fascinated by the story. As a college student studying history, she understood the importance of preserving family stories and encouraged Charles to document everything properly. Together, they created a detailed family history that included both the happy memories of William and Rose's marriage and the tragic story of William and Diana's wartime love. The wooden box now sits on Charles's mantelpiece, no longer hidden but displayed with honor. The letters and photographs are carefully preserved in archival materials, ensuring that future generations will be able to learn about this important piece of their family's history. Charles has kept his promise to visit Diana's grave regularly, and Robert continues to visit monthly when his health permits. Sometimes they meet there by coincidence. Two men separated by decades in age, but united in their respect for a young woman who died too soon. The story has brought Charles's family closer together in unexpected ways. Learning about William's ability to love deeply, lose tragically, and still find happiness again has given family members perspective on their own challenges and losses. The wooden box has become a symbol not just of hidden secrets, but of the enduring power of love and the importance of honoring those who came before us. Charles often thinks about what would have happened if Diana had lived, if she and William had been reunited after the war. Would they have been happy together? Would Charles and his family have ever existed? These questions have no answers, but they have helped Charles appreciate the complex chain of events that led to his own existence. The discovery has also changed how Charles thinks about his grandmother Rose. Rather than feeling that Diana's memory somehow diminishes Rose's place in the family, Charles now sees Rose as an even more remarkable woman who must have understood that William had loved before and supported him in carrying that memory forward. As Charles looks at the photographs of Diana Miller now, he sees not a threat to his family's history, but an important part of it. Her love for his grandfather and his grandfather's love for her had shaped William into the man who would later become a devoted husband to Rose and a loving father and grandfather to his family. The wooden box upstairs had indeed contained a hidden treasure, but not the kind Charles could have imagined when he first discovered it. It contained the story of love that transcends death, of memory that endures across decades, and of the beautiful complexity of human hearts that can hold both grief and joy, loss and hope, all at the same time. Today, when Charles drives past Hillside Cemetery, he no longer sees it as just another landmark in his hometown. He sees it as a place where love is remembered, where flowers bloom in honor of dreams that were cut short, and where two men from different generations learned to share the responsibility of keeping a beautiful memory alive.